Here's a thought. Everybody remembers going to primary school and their teachers at primary school. So just close your eyes and think of your teachers at primary school. Which one of them would you like to be identified as your named person? It's a scary thought, isn't it? Maybe one or two, just about okay. A lot of them, oh God. And two or three, never in 1,000 years. I think that's what most people think. And this whole discussion has got me thinking back to my own childhood and the way in which children learn about their own family and other people's families. I come from a large family. There's 7 children in my family. We cover 9 years. It was a formidable reproductive achievement by my mother. And I remember vividly in the school holiday, where every one of our friends would come round, and there'd be sometimes 12, 15 kids around in our house. And other kids would come and they'd sit there and they'd think, this is fantastic, you know, with this kind of constant melee of activity. And I'd go to some of my friends' houses who only had 1 or 2 children. I think, this is brilliant here, you know. Peaceful, and you get much more attention. And backwards and forwards. And you'd see that through this, and then you'd kind of go home and think, you know, well, actually, maybe it's not so bad after all in our house. Maybe there's some benefits and advantage either way. And through that whole process, you would learn about the general features of family life, about the diversity of families, and about the particularity of your own family. And also pick up, in the way that children are remarkably good at doing, just how different people's families are. People are different. They do it differently. It's not all done like it is in our house. They do it in another way in other people's house, and they get on with it. And they find their own way. I was particularly struck by this just yesterday. I was listening to the radio in the car, and there was a thing on the Radio 4 Pick of the Week. I missed the original programme. There was an interview with Michael Rutter. I don't know if anybody heard this last week. Michael Rutter is the preeminent child psychiatrist of the modern era, really. He's so preeminent, he's both a knight and a professor. Professor Sir Michael Rutter. And the question was put, he's retired now. I think he must be in his sort of probably late 70s. And the question was put to him, what was the single thing that he'd learned out of his long and distinguished career in dealing with young children? And the point that he made was that what people greatly underestimate is that children are active agents in their own families, and that people should never forget the subjectivity of children. And children are not passive recipients of their families. They have an active role in it. He made the very interesting point that this is something parents usually pick up with their second child, because they think the first child, this is what it's like, and then they realise, oh, actually it's different. You know, because having children is about a relationship, and it's families are about relationships, and children are a very active and significant feature which tends to be neglected in all these discussions. I really just want to make 2 points here by way of introduction to this about the named person thing, looking at it from some distance and not being familiar with the details of the Scottish issue. I live in North London. But it's fairly clear this fits in with the whole general dynamic of state interference in families, that on the one hand, they don't know what they're doing in this area, and secondly, that they have no idea that what they're doing could do harm. They're the two sort of striking features of it to me. That what you see here is the underlying the whole dynamic of professional state intervention in families is the presumption that there exists a body of professional wisdom about it, and that parents are incompetent in terms of raising their children. There's a sort of really quite alarming level of contempt and condescension towards parents and children in families underlying this whole process. Because actually having children is not about producing outcomes. In the discourse of this thing, it's about human relationships. It's about people who love one another finding their way through life together. It's not about the wheel of well-being, the my world triangle, the matrix of resilience, and all this gobbledygook that underlies the named person kind of initiative. It's about how people interact and live together in all their rich diversity, all their idiosyncrasies and eccentricities and rows and fallings out and gettings on and not gettings on. the whole idea of the state as and the professionals, the instruments at their disposal are far too crude. Their understanding of what's going on in this situation is far too unsophisticated and unsubtle to cope with the complexities and the subtleties of family relationships. It's very understandable. There's always this reaction to some child protection scandal to think that if only people had got in there early and done something. It's a very understandable and very alluring idea. If there'd been intervention at an early stage, the problem had been detected. Of course, this is a familiar thing to me in the world of medicine. If only everybody lived all their life in hospital, they'd never need to go to hospital when they got ill. And it is, if only everything could be prevented, then everything would be brilliant. But everything can't be prevented. And the idea that you can take every child in the world into care to prevent the few from is a nonsense. And as already been indicated, what the results is it tends to lead a skewing of resources away from the children who really need support, which is something I've got great experience of as a GP. If you want to get social services to do something for a family or provide, particularly for a family with children with disabilities of one sort or another, you can't do it. Or even actually, I've gone to some trouble to save children from being eaten by dangerous dogs. And if you want to do something about that, that's, seems to be incredibly difficult to organise. But the idea then is the way you deal with the end process is by having some universal provision of intervention is not only a nonsense, it's not only wishful thinking, but actually, and this is the second point I want to really emphasise, it is something which has significant adverse consequences. Because the whole problem of introducing a third party into the relationship between parents and their children is something which inevitably undermines confidence of parents and undermines the authority. And this is interesting, I thought, in these interviews that we just heard, that parents constantly recognise this danger of the undermining of parental authority. Parents instinctively understand that parental authority is of the essence in terms of raising children. And it's fascinating how a sense of this has been lost in the professional official world that's supposed to have great expertise in this. I was very struck by, I met the other weekend the mother of an old friend of mine who worked many years ago with Donald Winnicott, who was the preeminent child psychiatrist of the 50s and 60s. For 40 years worked at Paddington Green Hospital and was famed for his sensitivity to children's mental states and wrote very wisely on this subject. And if you read, I've read that there's a collection of Winnicott's writings published in 1965 that makes a fascinating contrast with the current wisdom of the period. He made the point that, particularly talking about doctors, that's something I took very much to heart as a GP, doctors should never interfere with a home that is a going concern, not even for its own good. And he emphasised doctors are especially liable to get in the way between parents and children, always with the best intentions. So you have this very clear idea that, parents should be left alone to get on with their children, and the idea that doctors should intervene in it is something which they should be very wary of it. All my professional life, I've avoided giving advice, and I've tried to discourage others from doing so. Can you imagine anything more alien to the current world of medical practice? As he emphasised that it was quite legitimate for doctors to give advice to people about something they knew something about, the treatment of disease, which, you might think, a little bit about at least, but it was quite illegitimate for them to advise people about problems of everyday life, which, as he said, was beyond their competence. And he had a very good understanding. This was what was a medical sphere of competence and what was beyond the medical sphere, and indeed is beyond the sphere of competence of departments of sociology. As he emphasised, doctors and nurses do not have to settle problems of living for their patients, who are men and women who are often more mature persons than themselves. And now, isn't that extraordinary? The idea that a senior medical consultant should express the idea that parents could be more mature persons than the doctors and nurses who might presume to advise them. It's really struck me a few years ago. A woman came into my surgery and asked me about somebody I knew, over the years. Asked me, and she was having difficulties with her usual problem, adolescent daughter, truculent adolescent problems, And I was thinking, just talking to her, that she had brought up 3 children on a very tough estate in Hackney on her own, with no money, conditions of great difficulty. Why is she asking me? You know, what do I know about that? You know, I know a bit about treating sore throats with penicillin. I know a bit about treating heart attacks. What do I know about bringing up children on difficult estates in Hackney with no money on your own? And that's what Winnicott understood, that doctors should stick to what they know about and not presume to interfere in other people's lives. Sorry, I've got to wind up now. But that was how the professional world understood the relationship in the past. This has collapsed utterly in our era. This was really about just a final part. I bring this to a close. Home to me not long ago. A woman came into the surgery. She'd been on one of these NCT, National Childbirth Trust parenting classes. Professional woman, rather anxious about her child, and she's saying, well, what they told me to say to the child was, you know, dealing with him was difficult, crying and wouldn't sleep and all that, feeding problem. I'm the boss. I am the boss. I am the boss. She had to keep saying to this child all the time. And I remember thinking to myself, it brought me back to my mother, you know, and I think in my mother, not for 1 millisecond in her life did my mother ever doubt that she was the boss. She's 95 now, she still thinks she's the boss. In fact, indeed, she still is the boss. But you know, the point is that if you have to say to your baby, I'm the boss, you know that you have lost it. You know, that shows you are no longer the boss if you've got to kind of say that you're the boss. And that is the problem of the current predicament. That's the situation that we've reached now, is even before a named person, and then the named person thing doesn't exist in England yet in that form. But you know, this culture of introducing a third party into this relationship already has that effect of undermining that relationship. It's so striking with young children. You know, if you see a 3 or a 4-year-old in a nursery, or a kindergarten, any sort of childcare facility, you know, sort of outside their own home, you know how they instinctively, if there's a bit of upset or want something, they know instinctively who's in charge to go to get whatever they want. I know that I've got a son with autism and severe learning difficulties who has no functional language at all. So in a sense, his developmental age is somewhat below the age of 2. In any kind of social situation like that, he knows instinctively who's in charge if he wants to get somebody to do something for him. So that, you know, young children know at a very, very early age who's in charge. And to know who's in charge is vitally important to a child, actually at every stage of their development. And it's vitally important for a parent to know that the buck stops with them in dealing with that. Once you set outside that, somebody else then is going to deal with the problem. You've undermined the whole situation. And that's the crisis that we've reached at the moment.